The Radical Secular Podcast. A demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, transcripts, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Hello and welcome back to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Christophe Defoe.
And I'm Joe Kipinti.
I'm Drew Scott.
Today's episode is the debut of the Too Late Show segment on the Radical Secular Podcast. These segments will feature my one-on-one conversations with guests I've selected on a range of topics. I believe that one of the best ways we can make our message of universal justice and universal human flourishing accessible to a broad audience is to apply the ideas we care about to real life through storytelling. On today's Too Late Show segment, my friends Stephanie Hoeler and Gwynn Kreuger join me to discuss, among other things, Stephanie's recent article published on pharmalive.com related to the representation of transgender and gender non-conforming folks in the healthcare industry. And before that, Joe, Drew, and I will discuss the clusterfuck that is Afghanistan. But first, I want to remind you that if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post on Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. And we also publish new articles regularly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. Okay, let's get into the t-shirts. Joe, what do you got for me, buddy?
So this is like on an old record, but I keep talking about the same. But
very nice. There is no planet B.
Very nice.
That is so true.
Yeah, the other cool thing about it is I have a tattoo of the same sort of tree of life, but simplified on my shoulder. And it's like, this is, we can't talk about it all the time, right? I mean, you get fatigued. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though it is just so fucking important, but a little mention once in a while, just like Star Trek, color change and then Star Trek.
Go ahead.
No, that was it.
I think that you're right, and I think that we should rehab our Star Trek thing, that somehow it comes up either incidentally or purposefully in every show. I think we should do the same thing with climate change. No, we don't have to beat the drum every single episode for the entire episode, but it is that important of a thing. I mean, it is by the most important thing. There is no more important thing.
It's our home.
That's it. No planet B.
No planet B.
Yeah. Drew, what do you got, buddy?
Well, I knew we'd be talking about Afghanistan today. And so given the state of, United States foreign policy, both now and throughout modern history, I thought this one would be pretty good. It's a
G.I. Joe, Jason Voorhees mashup shirt.
It's G.I. everybody out there. It's G.I. Joe, but with a Jason Voorhees sort of mashup. It's awesome.
It says G.I. Jason.
That's a pretty intense mashup.
Yeah.
I think it's perfect.
Yeah.
And back in the 80s and the 90s, I feel like they called American fighters GIs a lot more, right? Like that sort of has gone out of fashion.
In Vietnam too.
Oh yeah, Vietnam. That was big in Vietnam for sure. A GI walking down the street, for sure. So go ahead.
I was just gonna say the whole G.I. Joe franchise was reborn in the 1980s out of largely, Reaganistic nationalism. That's why they felt comfortable bringing that toy line back after so many years of non-existence.
Yeah, and then
because patriotism was popular at the time.
And then you had the huge series Rocky, right? The Rocky.
Oh my God, the Rocky series,
they were
absolutely. Huge.
Yeah.
I went back and I've watched the first one, I don't know, it was a couple years ago. And I was like, first of all, taken aback at how low budget it is. Like, wow. You're like, holy shit. And how young Stallone is. But also, right, like it really captures that, that before it went completely off the rails in some of the later ones, it really captured this like a sentiment that was real, a forgotten soldier coming home from Vietnam, right? Looking for his buddies, all of whom are dead. I mean, that was a very real story, especially in the 1980s, as like those Vietnam War vets got to an age to be a little bit more reflective,
Yeah, and also Rocky 3, I think, was a Mujahideen, right? It's Afghanistan.
That's right. Oh my God, you're absolutely right. Of course, that was like that. You want to talk about jingoistic? I mean, like,
right.
wow,
That
comical. It was bad. It was so bad.
Rambo 3 is like that too, where they're defending the freedom fighters against the
I think that's what I messed
the
up.
evil Russians.
Okay, so maybe that's the one we're thinking
It's Rambo
of.
3.
Rambo. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm mixing up Rambo and Rocky too. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I'm doing the same thing. I just did a whole talk about Rambo, not Rocky.
Yeah.
I should have said it was my fault. I should have said Rambo to begin with. Right?
Well, anyway.
I was like, is that the one with Ivan Drago?
Yeah. I was getting them all like mixed up.
I'm looking at Drew, and he's like, Drew's giving us this kind of friendly but kind of peculiar look.
What the hell are you guys talking about? So my shirt today, I'm wearing my intersectionality shirt, trans lives, LGBTQ lives, Black lives, etc. So I'll just show it off.
Awesome. Yeah. So important.
Absolutely. And we talked a lot about that on the guest segment that is pre-recorded, so I can talk about it like as if it already exists, because it already exists. And we talked about intersectionality a lot, and I think that's sort of an important element. So, well, look, we're gonna let's get into the body of the show now, and that means we're gonna talk about Afghanistan. As I say frequently on this show, I believe our audience is pretty well informed, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time doing the play-by-play of everything that's happened. If you don't know what's happened, and you can check out the New York Times, they've really covered this very, very well. But I will do some recapping here because I want to draw some comparisons between the collapse of the 20-year American-led effort in Afghanistan and the decade-long American-led effort in Vietnam and Southeast Asia in the middle 20th century. And we're going to talk about that, Joe, because you and I have a little conversation to have about that. But let's begin with some background information about the Taliban. I'm going to read some excerpts from the New York Times piece that I was mentioning. Quote, "Who are the Taliban? The Taliban arose in 1994 amid the turmoil that came after the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan in 1989. They used brutal public punishments, including floggings, amputations, and mass executions to enforce their rules. Who are the Taliban leaders? The top leaders of the Taliban have spent years on the run, in hiding, in jail, and dodging American drones. The movement's supreme leader is Hibatullah Akhundzada, and its political leader is Abdul Ghani Baradar. They are emerging now from obscurity, but little is known about them or how they plan to govern. I have an inkling. The Taliban claim to be more tolerant than they were in the 90s, even willing to work with women. But have they really cast off their extremist ideology, or is it all a ruse? And what will happen to women in Afghanistan? The last time the Taliban were in power, they barred women and girls from taking most jobs or going to school. Afghan women have made many gains since the Taliban were toppled, but now they fear that ground may be lost as the militants retake power. And finally, what does the Taliban victory mean for terrorist groups? The United States invaded Afghanistan ostensibly 20 years ago in response to terrorism, and many worry that Al-Qaeda and other radical groups will again find safe haven there, end quote. And I'd like to now touch on the Taliban's astonishingly fast recapture of Afghanistan. And again, the New York Times reports, quote, in early May, I found this passage very, very compelling. In early May, a Taliban commander telephoned Mohammed Jalal, a tribal heir in Baghlan province in northern Afghanistan, and asked him to deliver a message to the Afghan troops at the several bases in his district. If they do not surrender, we will kill them, Mr. Jalal was told. He and other tribal leaders complied. After several rounds of negotiations, 2 government bases and 3 outposts surrendered without a fight. More than 100 security forces handed over weapons and equipment and were sent home unarmed. The Taliban strategy of coercion and persuasion was repeated across the country, unfolding for months as a focal point of the insurgents' new offensive this year. The militants cut multiple surrender deals that handed them bases and ultimately entire provincial command centers, culminating in a stunning military blitz this summer that put the militants back in power 2 decades after they were defeated by the United States and its allies. Each surrender, large or small, handed the Taliban more weapons and more vehicles, and vitally, more control over roads and highways, giving insurgents freedom to move rapidly and collect the next surrenders as the security forces were progressively cut off from ammunition, fuel, food, and most importantly, salaries. The Taliban triumph came just 4 months after President Biden announced on April 14th that he would honor the deal with the Taliban signed by the Trump administration to withdraw all American troops beginning on May 1st. The announcement sank the morale of an already beleaguered security force. The Taliban seized the advantage in May, crushing government troops now forced to defend themselves with only occasional long-distance American airstrikes to help them hold off Taliban surges. The Taliban received money, supplies, and support from Pakistan, Russia, and Iran that included 10,000 to 20,000 Afghan volunteers sent from Pakistan, a Taliban safe haven, and thousands more Afghan villagers who joined the militants when it became clear they were winning. The volunteers swelled Taliban ranks to more than 100,000 fighters. That was more than enough to crush a government force listed at 300,000 on paper, but hollowed out by corruption, desertion, and a staggering casualty rate. The key to victory was the Taliban's plan to threaten and cajole security forces and government officials into surrendering, first at the checkpoint and outpost level, then the district and provincial level as they swept through the countryside. They contacted everyone and offered the chance to surrender or switch sides with incentives, including money and rewarding people with appointments afterward. The Taliban exploited Afghans' resentment towards a corrupt and ineffective government that was unable to supply its forces or mount an effective media campaign to rally the public to its side. By contrast, the Taliban pounded home a message through social media and village elders that the government was illegitimate and the militants would soon restore their Islamic rule. Their outreach was fantastic. Their planning was very good. They managed the element of surprise. They capitalized on intra-tribal, ethnic, religious, and ideological differences to win people over. And they made the most of the people's frustrations with the government. Now, end quote. That's a lot. I admittedly picked passages here which bolster my view that there are some stark parallels between the collapse of the U.S.-backed Afghan troops in 2021 and the collapse of the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese troops in 1974. Now, Joe, sort of like I'm going to poke the bear a little bit here. You said on social media this week that the war in Afghanistan is not the war in Vietnam. Why don't you go ahead and defend that position?
Well, what I was trying to say is that the consequences are very different. And there are some similarities because basically, before I get to that, a lot of this really comes out of colonialism, right? And the way that the British dealt with colonies is really contributed to creating a very fragmented society. It was fragmented to begin with. I mean, it's a very mountainous region. Mountainous people tend to be relatively isolated. They still connect, but less so. And the British and the big colonial powers had two reasons why they would take over territory, right? One is to have resources, like in India. India was a massive resource base for them. And the other one is as buffer states in their contests with other colonial powers. And so the British weren't interested so much in resources with Afghanistan. They just wanted a buffer against the Russians at the time between the Russia and India. And so they did whatever they needed to do to keep control of that territory. And the way they did it was by dividing and conquer, by partitioning, because there was a very spirited movement in Afghanistan backed by internationalists, right? The same people who they were fighting, Franco in the 1920s and 30s, right? That international sort of anti-colonial movement, the socialists and all that, they were there too. And and they're all about unity, right? And so the British were really fighting the locals and this group, and by really just dividing and conquering, dividing over and over and over again, they left that legacy in that country. And it's been that way ever since. Afghanistan has been just brutally divided by its own history and then by colonialism. And so when George Bush went in there after 9/11 and decided that nation building was going to be the thing, right? it was, everyone was knew what, anybody in the know was saying, wow, this is going to be tough. What, you don't know what the hell you're getting yourself into. This nation building here, really, here
Oh God,
in
of all places.
Yeah. And I'm not against nation building, like just per se. There's some reasons to do it sometime, like for, to do that and so forth. But in this case, it was a massive challenge. And so what do you learn if you are living in a very fragmented society that's been going through civil war for decades, right? From the Soviets to the Mujahideen to Taliban. What do you learn to do? You got to go with the winners, right? Mm-hmm. You're a little segment of society. You have your own little force, but you got to go with what's happening with the currents of power. And so the Taliban did that. That was their strategy, right? They wanted to show themselves as legitimate in that way and get everybody else to join them, because that's what you do in Afghanistan. You don't have a national identity.
Right.
And so if you're in the Afghan government or the military and you've been trained and all that, you're doing it because you're getting a salary, you're getting training, you're getting legitimacy, you're getting a life, and you're doing it for your family, you're doing it even for your community, but you're not doing it for the nation.
Right. That's important.
And so when it came down to it, why fight with a side that looks like it was going to lose? Because remember, the United States had started to withdraw way back, years and years back, right? So the writing was on the wall that Taliban were going to eventually take back the place. And so people said, why should we have a war? Let's just get it over with.
I know, it's super smart, frankly. I mean, they're like, look, I mean, let's see if we can avoid some bloodshed here. I want to give you a chance to react, Drew, if you have any comments on any of that.
Yeah, I think Joe made a good point about the consequences being different. I don't think Vietnam and a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, in terms of their place in the world, are going to be anything alike.
Right.
But I do think Christophe has a point in that, in terms of America's foreign policy approach to both scenarios, with this kind of vague idea of nation building without really understanding the history and the culture of the people they intended to conquer, and while also underestimating them and underestimating their devotion and underestimating their resilience. I think those parallels are too stark to ignore. I think Christophe is right about that, but I do think Joe is also right about the consequences being different.
Yeah, well said.
I think that's right. And Joe, I want to clarify here. I mean, I set this up as sort of as some sort of adversarial thing, and it's not really, because I think we're both actually right. And that is that, and I think you mentioned this, and it's absolutely true. We're talking about Handmaid's Tale when we're talking about the Taliban, and we're talking about that radical. I would say radical Islam, but it's actually just Islam, right? Like, it's just basically what the book says, right? If you actually, it's like if somebody did what the actual Bible said, we'd be enslaving people and killing people's children, right? Like, so yeah, I mean, like, if you actually do what those books say, you get really insane outcomes. And I agree with you that there's a stark difference between that and the North Vietnamese. For all their brutality, there's definitely a stark difference. I want to point out some things for our audience and for everyone that I'm, as everyone probably knows if you've been listening to this show, I am very much a Vietnam War buff. I'm low-key, high-key, frankly, obsessed with it. And so I wrote down some steps. It's a 9-step scenario. I'll try. I won't hit all of them, but anyway, here we go. 1, the United States invades Afghanistan with nation building and or proxy war aspirations. 2, the United States invades without an exit strategy or any understanding of the country's history or internal tribal dynamics. 3, the United States spends billions of dollars, thousands of lives over multiple decades building a U.S.-friendly government in Afghanistan and hires and trains a well-equipped indigenous fighting force to defend it. 4, the fighting force is made up of a handful of diehard patriots who embrace American ideals, but mostly it's made up of guys of dubious loyalty who are there for a paycheck. The entire force is trained to fight a rich man's war, relying on airstrikes and high-tech equipment. 5. The United States military and civilian leaders tricked themselves and then the American people into believing that their progress building a government and military that looks great on paper is tantamount to winning the war. 6. A well-organized indigenous resistance movement, backed by America's adversaries in the international community, mounts a low-grade but consistent guerrilla war against American and Afghan forces. 7. The resistance movement absorbs staggering casualties, standing up to American and Afghan firepower, but its leaders realize that each American life it takes inches them closer to American disengagement. 6. Public opinion in the United States turns against the war, and it becomes clear, even to the hawkish among American politicians, that the war is unwinnable and it's time to get out of Afghanistan. 7. America announces that it's pulling out of Afghanistan, believing its own propaganda, and suggests that the force and government it's built there will stand and fight the guerrilla forces. 8. The guerrilla forces go on an all-out offensive, but rather than violently crushing the Afghan forces, which they certainly could do, they opt to appeal to shared identity, threats, and frustration with the U.S.-backed government to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, and thereby win Afghanistan back with minimal violence. And finally, 9. The United States engaged in a scrambling and embarrassing exit from Afghanistan. Now, I could replace Afghanistan with Vietnam, and 99% of what I just said would be absolutely true. Like all those exact same things happened in Vietnam. It's remarkable.
The first thing that I thought of when I saw those images of, the planes taking off with the people scrambling to cling to them. I mean, aside from the horror of the whole thing, was I thought of those helicopters being pushed into the sea at the end of the Vietnam War. That was the first thing that I thought of for sure.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead, Joe.
Again, I mean, what's different is when the Viet Cong took over Vietnam, they instituted a constitution that was protective of women, for example. Right? They believed in science. They tried to modernize their society. They created schools, healthcare, all of that stuff. You might not like the fact that they were communists, so quote unquote, right? You might not like some of the things they did. It's fine, and that's a legitimate argument and a legitimate critique to make about the Vietnamese. But they did all these things because they're part of modernity. They're part of the Enlightenment project. That's not the case with the Taliban. They really are very medieval, and they don't believe in science, and they're very brutal towards women and girls, and they are. They cut off people's body parts to punish them. I mean, it's medieval. It's a very, very different kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And we can't forget that consequence ultimately. And that's what I was talking about, guys, more than anything else. I mean, I agree with you got completely 100% that the history of it, the way it unfolded is stunningly similar to Vietnam.
Yeah. But your point is a good one. And again, like, I mean, we're not both. I think that we're both right? Like, I mean, it's different in these ways. The critical thing, and all three of us have talked about this online. Sean talked about this online this week. And one thing that, whatever our interpretations of it are, there is no doubt that women are fucked. Like, that is absolutely right. Women were fucked even in the modern Afghanistan. Now they are beyond fucked. I mean, beyond fucked. It is. I just can't imagine. A friend of mine lives in Colorado, and he is he's a rock climber. And Matt, if you're out there, good to see you. And he had connected with a group of mountaineers in the mountains in Afghanistan, right? There's like the biggest, some of the most hardcore mountains there are. And so these women had gotten involved in this, and there was like this sort of, they had an Instagram account, and they were out there doing this stuff, and it's like, what's going to happen to them? Like, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I felt so horrible for those people running for that plane, because those are the people who understand all of this.
Exactly.
Those are the people who understand the consequences of a Taliban takeover and know what that means and know what is essentially, religious tyranny. Yeah. They understand what the consequences of that are for them and their families. And I'm a person who's afraid of flying. Like I'll get on a plane if I need to, but I'm kind of a nervous, not anymore. I mean, like in the before time, in the long ago.
Yeah.
But I'm a nervous flyer. I don't like flying. So when I see stuff like that and I see people dropping off of the plane as it's taking off, those images, I mean, it's hard to put into words. It's really, really horrifying.
It's horrifying, and it just demonstrates the desperation.
Yeah.
And again, I really want to emphasize how this is different, because like you think about, it's very much medieval. And
medieval, I thought I wanted to mention that's really great.
Think about this, okay? Think about how in Europe they used to burn women as witches, tens of thousands, like maybe even more than that. We don't really know, but huge percentage. Who were they burning? They were burning any woman who had the gall to do any kind of agency or any kind of minor power in their village. The herbalists or whatever it might, and it was terrorism, right? Why did you do that? Because it kept them in their place. And what happens in Afghanistan? They don't burn. They don't use pyres, but you know what happens a lot? Throwing a car acid battery in women's faces.
Just like,
right?
What the fuck?
Stonings. It's the same thing. It's not just the government, because the government sets the tone, right?
Sure.
And allows any fucked up, brutal man to be able to be abusive and with no consequences. So it even happens in the homes, not just by government forces doing this to women. And they don't get to go to school.
Yeah, literally, right. I mean, it is just oppression on an almost unimaginable scale. And what you mentioned, Joe, is really important, is that, right, women have difficulty getting justice against their husbands in the United States, right? In constitutional democracies with robust systems of accountability.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
It's a challenge. Like, I mean, that is an uphill battle constantly, right? Can you, like, and it just go, and that is in a modern democracy, right? Such that it is democracy. And these women in Afghanistan now, they are trapped in their homes. They can't work. They can't read, and you're trapped in your home, and you are a slave. It's slavery. It's straight up slavery is what it is. Straight up slavery,
Yeah, the level of oppression is frightening. I mean, seeing shopkeepers paint over, images of women that they had on the sides of the buildings, with posters and stuff, having to cover that up because they know the Taliban's coming. They know what they'll do to them if they don't cover it up.
Right.
It's horrifying. Well,
let's move on. It wouldn't be an episode of the Radical Secular Podcast without some mention of Star Trek. So I'm going to go ahead and read the language of Starfleet's General Order 1, along with some interpreting regulations. It'll be just a minute. I know I've been doing a lot of reading today, but it's just that kind of episode. There's just a lot to talk about, So here it is. Quote, "No starship may interfere with the normal development of any alien life or society. General Order 1 is better known as the Prime Directive. It supersedes all other laws and directives with the exception of the Omega Directive," which I don't even know what that is. "Starfleet officers are prohibited from directly intervening in the natural outcome of any internally motivated political or military conflict, even if non-intervention will result in the extinction of an entire species or the end of all life on a planet or star system." Now, Joe, you have firsthand experience with the intended and unintended consequences of U.S.-led incursions into developing countries. Will you comment on that experience in general and perhaps also in terms of the Prime Directive? Another way of coming at this question is, what should have America done or not done in Afghanistan? Go ahead, Joe.
Sure.
Have at it.
So much here. But first, let me just follow up on another Star Trek reference. In DS9, there's this incredible episode of Jake Sisko, who gets caught in a war zone when they were fighting the Dominion, and he went through the brutality of war and the terror of war and the humanity of war and the shame of feeling afraid and all that. And when I think about that, and I think about the people that had sacrificed themselves, all American soldiers, to try, and a lot of them really believed in the mission. A lot of them really believed they were doing good and really just sacrificed so much for this mission. And I want to say something about them too, because, I'm not a warmonger. I don't, but I do respect that sacrifice. I respect it and I honor it. And I think it's important because it's just unimaginable. I've never been in a war zone like that. I can't even, I can only say from, these kinds of experiences. But what I have done though, I have worked with and been with and become friends with the people who have been brutalized, as directly or indirectly by American, imperialism and Cold War aggressiveness, that has swept through the world in the 20th century. And we shouldn't fool ourselves at how much the United States was involved in a lot of brutality in the world. For example, I lived in Argentina in the mid 90s, and it was about maybe just under 10 years after the junta, the dictatorship fell there because of the Falkland War. They lost the war, they lost their legitimacy, and they fell. But it was a U.S.-backed, U.S.-trained, U.S. intelligence infused dictatorship to fight communists. And so what they would do, they created these paramilitary squads and these security squads. They would sweep their landscape and look for insurgents, and who are the insurgents? Well, in this village where I was, and villages like it, they would get their information. These death squads would get their information from evangelicals to the CIA to them, and the locals figured this out. So, when we went there and lived in this village, they thought we were either evangelical, doing the same thing, or CIA agents, right? And it took us months to really break through that and convince people that we weren't, which is researchers, right? And the women that I talked to, is one woman who was a friend of mine, and she's told me about, she was a social worker. She wasn't even a radical. She was just working with the poor. That's all it took, right? Somebody ratted her out, and that was it. And she ended up in the prison.
Wow.
Right. And she had pretty bad PTSD from that. It was a brutal experience. And you know what they used to do? I mean, tens of thousands of people disappeared. And it came out later. What they would do is the military would take them up on planes, fly them over the ocean, and dump them.
That is just,
except for the pregnant leftist women who they would hold until they had a baby, steal their baby, and then they would kill them. Right. And these tactics were known. They were known, right? And it was, this kind of activity was happening all over the world. In Iran, right? The Iranian Revolution happened because we were backing and funding the Ayatollah. The Shah of Iran. He was replaced by the Ayatollah. And the Shah of Iran had a brutal police force just like that.
Yep.
Right? Funded by the U.S., right? Yeah. And trained in a lot of ways. There was the School of Americas in the Southwest would take the elites of these countries, the colonels and so forth, would train them in a lot of these anti-insurgency tactics, and then send them back.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Joe, I'm sorry to cut you off. I want to, though, because this is so important.
I'm passionate about this.
No, I know. I want you to be. It's fucking fantastic. This is exactly why I wanted to talk to you about this, because it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds to me like you have seen the on the ground effects of U.S. sort of, picking a side and backing it for whatever reasons. And a lot of that ends up with people that, right. And so from what I understand in South America too, it's like, look, it's easier to control a dictator than it is to control a democracy. A dictator can keep his people in line and be cozy up to America. And we all shrug our shoulders and turn the other way when he's throwing guys out of airplanes.
Now, I do want to say that after the Cold War ended, the CIA and the military actually changed, and it got much better.
Yeah.
The United States, much more professional, much more conscious of human rights than they were before. But sadly, after 9/11, started to go down again. Not as bad, but in many ways, there's that pressure to fight and deal with the threat that you say, well, we just got to put the niceties, quote unquote, out the window and do what we need to do. And But I don't want to diss the entire U.S. military. Not at all. I think there's some great people in it doing some great work.
I think on this show we're pretty careful about separating, this foreign policy or imperialism, frankly, of the United States and Western allies with the actual people that do the work and what it means to be in the military. And I think that's important because I, as you know, have a deep respect for the military. And Drew, I just want to give you a chance to comment on the Prime Directive in terms of Afghanistan. Like, where do you like? I mean, as a concept, I mean, just in general, do you have any thoughts?
I think it's complicated, like many things in the world are. I'm a part of that generation that kind of came of age in the shadow of 9/11 and post 9/11 hysteria and all of that. I did not like Bush. I was not old enough to vote for him the first time or vote for anyone the first time, but I voted against him the second time. I was against the Iraq war completely. The Afghanistan war, I kind of understood because that was where the people who attacked us were trained in Harvard. In that sense, I understand, a military reaction to that. I think that's normal for, just about any country to do after an attack like that. Go after who did it. At the same time, I do kind of feel like once Obama got bin Laden, that probably should have just been it.
Right.
Like, we got the guy, done. Get the fuck out of there, know? Yeah. So it's complicated. There's a lot of bad, horrible people in the world that want to do bad things to America and Americans and our allies. And we can't ignore that and be complete pacifists. On the other hand, we can't be imperialists or hyper-nationalists or warmongers, as Joe was talking about. It's a fine line and a complicated issue.
Yeah, and so to return back to the Prime Directive, because I didn't answer your question, right?
I mean, you kind of did, but go ahead.
I was getting to it, and what Drew said fits right into that, right? It's the idea that there's a reason why in late 1960s, the producers of Star Trek introduced the Prime Directive into that show. They were coming out of our own history, right? They were seeing some of this stuff. They were seeing what happened with colonialism. Right, in particular, Native Americans in this country. It was a reaction to our own history, why we created that sci-fi Prime Directive, right? And it didn't come out of some fantasy novel, right? It was real, right? And what Drew was saying, yeah, we need to do that, but we also have to be realistic about, there are some bad guys we got to deal, and all that. But at least that's a guidepost for us, right? And because they broke the Prime Directive all the time in Star Trek, right? It was
all the time. Yeah.
But it was a guidepost, right? It was a guidepost.
It was a guidepost, and I mean, you had a Picard who was more or less obsessed with it. You had a Kirk who was just like fire from the hip with it. Although he was better, I think Janeway was probably the worst. Just fast and loose with the Prime Directive. But again, it's context specific, and I think what we're getting at here, in one of the important things, I think the rule makes sense because you just cannot, your best laid plans, right? And it's sort of, you just don't know what the outcome is going to be. And when you start going down that road. Now, I want to sort of wrap up our conversation here, or the last chunk of our conversation. So I personally really support Biden's quite imperfect approach to ending the quagmire in Afghanistan. I think he did the right thing. I certainly don't speak for all members of the radical secular team when I say that, and I do think reasonable people can disagree. Now, given the position in which the Biden administration finds itself in terms of Afghanistan, what is the right thing to do by the Afghan people, now? And how is that different from the practical, politically viable thing to do? Maybe Drew, you want to have any thoughts on that? What should we do?
I think we should make our best efforts to get people out who want to get out. We did the same thing for South Vietnamese when they wanted to flee that regime. It's complicated, It's because we did make something of a promise to those people. We're committed to helping them. and they helped us to fight people who were our enemies. So I don't think leaving them high and dry is the right thing. At the same time, after 20 years of military support and billions of dollars, who knows how many lives lost on all sides, it's like, where are we? What are we going for here? What? I don't know, man. It's a mess. And I think, just lastly, I want to say that the elephant in the room here is religion.
Yes.
This is a show called The Radical Secular, and I would be remiss if I did not bring that up, because, I think a lot of people on the left are reluctant to criticize Islam in particular, because it is a religion practiced by largely brown people. And liberals don't want to criticize the brown people for pretty much anything these days.
It's true.
Yeah.
Right. So it puts you in this box where, you want to be the multicultural rainbow where you welcome all ideas and cultures. But what if culture A wants to murder and enslave culture B? What if culture B thinks that all LGBT people and women should all be subjugated? What if, culture D thinks that all other cultures should be wiped out? I mean, it's not that simple. Yeah. So, but until you address, getting everyone on the same page in terms of accepting the terms of reality of this world that we're all in through science and evidence and, the scientific method, until you get everyone on that page, this mess in Afghanistan, this is the kind of shit that you're going to see in the world.
Yeah. That's a really great point. I'm so glad you brought that up, Drew.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for me, the jury's still out with Biden. We'll see what happens, because there is potential to make this somewhat better. Certainly not right, but there is. And that's because, the Taliban are very, very dependent. The country of Afghanistan has no cash. They have no money. And they were getting who was paying the salaries for the government employees? The school teacher. It was us.
Right.
The United States.
That's a good point.
And Japan, right? Japan too. And so they got no money. They have no at all. And this is the hook that the world can say, look, guess what? We'll give you aid, we'll give you support, but you need to do human rights. And you have to do this and that. And there's a potential there for the United States, Biden's administration, to lead that effort for the world to do that. And if he does that, if they do that, then I'll say, okay, it was a good move. Right. If he doesn't, then he's going to deserve condemnation for at least that part of it.
Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
I agree with both you guys. It was time to get out, and there was no easy decisions. And I think probably ultimately weighing everything, getting out was the right call, right? But let's do the best we can to mitigate the damage here, because the damage is tremendous.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think we have a moral and ethical obligation to do that. It's not even really a question mark. Like, if you had it up to me, you go to, somehow tell every Afghan and say, like, look, if you want to come to the United States, you can, right? Like, a lot of people won't, right? In fact, most people won't, but a lot of people will. And I mean, like, in a perfect world, I think that is the ethical thing to do, because we have irreparably, or not irreparably, but we have so dramatically changed the trajectory of that country's development. And 20 years is a long ass time. 20 years of American bombs is a long ass time. Right. I think that we owe it to them. But that's different, obviously, from the political question. Right. And I mean, I think it's really interesting that on the right, there is a rift going on the right about immigration, right? Because you have these sort of like drum beating hawkish people who are like, no, we got to help people. These are the deserving immigrants. This is the exact kind of deserving immigrants, which I hate that fucking shit. Like, but then on the other hand, you have like the Marjorie Taylor Greens who are just like, fuck all brown people. I don't care what they did. They don't deserve to be here, and they're terrorists. So, right. So it's interesting to see it will be interesting to see how that issue develops, for the midterms, especially, because this is going to be a really interesting question. But I do think, Joe, because the strategy for the Biden administration was basically allow the Afghan forces to withdraw to the big cities, right? And then we'll defend them like fortresses. And in the meantime, we will be doing diplomatic stuff. We'll be pushing them with carrots and sticks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the first part of that plan did not work out, right? No. So now we are behind the eight ball and all of that. So we'll see how it goes. Again, I do tend to support the Biden approach here, and I think there's a level of bravery for just doing it, right? Just ripping the Band-Aid off, like knowing that the criticism is going to be fast and furious, and it should be. If it's bad, absolutely should be. But in any event, I don't want to keep going on this just because we are sort of short on time. So it was just a great conversation, guys. Let's move on now to our guest segment. I'm pleased to welcome to the show my friends Stephanie Hoeler and Gwynn Kreuger for a discussion about social justice in the healthcare industry. I'm super stoked to get the perspective of people with extensive experience living and parenting in non-white and/or non-binary bodies. So without further ado, The Radical Secular presents Stephanie and Gwynn. Hello and welcome to the Too Late Show segment on the Radical Secular podcast. My name is Christophe Defoe, and I'm here to tell you unequivocally that it is just too fucking late. Today, my friends Stephanie and Gwynn have joined me for a discussion about social justice in the American healthcare system. How the hell are you two doing? And tell us about your t-shirts.
Doing great. I have a Black Wall Street t-shirt, which sort of commemorates the businesses in Oklahoma that were burned to the ground. So maybe that'll be taught one day.
Thank God. Thank God. I love that t-shirt. Awesome. And Gwynn, how about you?
I'm wearing my Meetup Pride shirt. So I work for Meetup. I'm the director of customer experience there. And I'm part of the employee resource group, Meetup Pride. So we have a lot of pride. Just wanted to represent that today.
Awesome. Awesome. And I already did my t-shirt earlier in the show, but I'll do it again. I said I wasn't going to do it again, but I'm going to do it again anyway. And the big joke was that I'm wearing the band t-shirt to the show, which you're never supposed to do. But it is my intersectionality t-shirt, pro-trans, pro-LGBT, pro-civil rights, frankly. So anyway, we're really glad to have you guys here, you both here. It's out fucking standing to have you here. Let's just jump into it with just getting some background on you two. How do you two know each other? I'll let Gwynn just start us off.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie and I live in the same suburbia bedroom community of New York City, out in South Orange, Maplewood, New Jersey. And so you get to know everybody in your town and you whittle down like who do you actually want to be friends with. And so Stephanie was definitely like one of the first and maybe some of the only people that I want to be friends with out here.
Yeah. The suburbs experience is an experience, isn't it? I mean, and I know that, right? I know that Maplewood is a great suburb, right? I drive through there. There's like Black Lives Matter sort of posters all over the place, like South Orange, the entire area, like, right, the entire Essex County area, that sort of really cool little suburb of New York is pretty good. But I mean, I wonder though, either of you, like, how comfortable do you feel there? I mean, I guess that's the question, right? Like, I grew up in the suburbs, right? So, I mean, and my suburbs were a little bit different. My suburbs were conservative, definitely red country, New Jersey, for sure. And it was also the 90s and not 2021, right? And so it was definitely a different experience. But I wonder, like, how frankly accepted do you feel as non-traditional suburbanites in some way?
I mean, I think that I feel comfortable, but it's like any other town. You know, sometimes I joke with people about like just missing the outward honesty of the rural Midwest. You know, No one has a flag outside the shop or any place. You know, I'm not going to the country club, but everyone assures me that I would be welcome there. You know, yeah. I mean, I feel pretty comfortable, but yeah, I just feel like it's a more polite than some other places I've lived.
And speaking of which, I want to follow up on that. Rural Indiana, right?
Yeah.
Like, what was that like? I've lived in rural Montana, right? And I know what that was like. So what was rural Indiana like?
I mean, I loved, absolutely loved parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's had I stayed there, I never would have known what I was missing.
Mm-hmm.
I was intent on not staying there. Um, it's just like I love it, and I don't want to trash talk it too bad, but it's
Fair
just
enough.
there's not like tons of diversity. I hear that it's changing now. Where I went to high school is where Mayor Pete was mayor, South Bend, Indiana, and so it's undergone a lot of change since I was last there. But like there were just whites, blacks, and all Hispanics or Mexicans is what it felt like.
Sure.
And then to come to a different area, to come out east was just like culture shock to the nth degree. And I just loved every bit of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I joke, I would like, I could see being in the Midwest for like certain phases of life. Like it's a great place to like just be a kid, run wild. You see an 8-year-old by themselves out here, and it's like something's wrong and someone's about to call the cops. But in the Midwest, you could just be.
Mm-hmm. I had a similar experience in Montana, right? I mean, I would say the same thing, that it's a great place to be a kid. You can do whatever you want. Your parents really can just open the door and just kick you out in the morning, and you'll be back at night. You may maybe get eaten by like a wolf, right? Like that might be, you're like in the food chain. So I guess there's like sort of that concern. But you don't, but it's a great place, right? You can do outdoor activities, stuff that you just can't do. Certainly, I live in Jersey City, New Jersey. I certainly wouldn't want my kid out all night, all day around here. They might just get hit by a car. There's a million things that could go wrong. Now, Gwynn, so without going into any details you don't want to, but like, where have you lived? Have you lived in this area your entire life? Or?
Yeah. I'm actually from like 20 minutes from here in
Okay.
a slightly like more like white, pinkish or purplish area of Essex County,
Okay.
Roseland in the Caldwell.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. But then I moved, like when I was like in my early 20s, I moved to the city in Brooklyn and spent a good 15 years, and then got married, and we have a kid, and so we moved back. And this was the area we were like, if we're gonna move back, this is the spot to move back to. And while I don't disagree with that, my past self, I've had the honeymoon is over in terms of how liberal and how liberal this area is. Yeah,
I can understand that. It like the reality sort of starts to set in a little bit, right? And relatedly, and so I want to sort of ask you both a question. It relates to all of our experience in some sense, but I want to pose it to you two first. And so none of the three of us are heteronormative white men who live in the United States. And that means almost by definition that our lives have involved some level of adversity related to the fact that we're not heteronormative white men who live in the United States. So what, if anything, do you want to express to our audience about the experience of being you? What do most people not understand or miss about your experience? And so, go ahead and just have fun with that. Gwynn, you want to go first?
Sure. I think that, the person that you see, like how I present on this screen, I started transitioning in a medical way, like only a year and some change ago. So like before that, I presented as a very masculine woman, like assigned at birth, assigned female at birth person. So like some people would know me, and I identified for a really long time as a butch lesbian. So like now, when I meet people who like strangers who don't know me, they assume that I'm a cis guy most of the time at this point. And that is like absolutely not my experience. So it's just, it's kind of a trip to be both living in this reality that like on one level, some level, like I always really wanted that and felt internally like that. But that hasn't been my experience at all. So, and I'm shaped, we're all shaped by our experiences. So it's just, I have this unique experience that people don't necessarily, they don't know that I've had it. And so it's just more than meets the eye,
Yeah, that is really powerful, and one of the themes that we've been talking about over the course of this show and the earlier segment, and what I've sort of envisioned us getting to, especially when we get to your article, Stephanie, is this idea of being seen, right? And I think one thing that, in my experience, is, right, I am, a cisgendered male, black male, but but I think that, and I know, we all know that, right, when people see us, they make a cascading assumptions about us based, and not just us, I mean anybody, right, but certainly us, right, based on what they think a black man is, what they think a white man is, what they think a trans man or woman is, and I think that, and it's really hard, I think, and it's even hard for me to even put it into words, and I'm obviously fumbling with it now, but it's hard to put into words what the feeling is of having that mismatch of feeling like certain way on the inside, where I'm like, my experience as a black man is a little bit wonky, right? Like, I don't talk like a black guy, right? I didn't grow up around black people. I grew up around all white people, right? And my experience is like the experience of like a suburban white kid. Like, that is my experience, right? And people look at me and they're like, and anyway, so I can identify to some extent with that sort of mismatched feeling. Certainly less so from what I understand, but nevertheless. And now, Stephanie, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that as well.
I think Gwynn really hit it with the more than meets the eye. I was thinking about a meeting I was on earlier, and I'm on this senior leadership team at work. I'm a SVP at an advertising agency, and I was about to ask a couple of questions, but first I did my internal check and preparation for my tone, because I've been told that I'm abrupt or it can be brash. And, this question could very well come off as criticism, that's unwarranted. So let me just do a little tone check before I ask the question. And there's been some times where I'm like, the question's not worth it. But yeah, I would say that the just more than meets the eye in terms of, like you mentioned, the cascading assumptions, and we're doing the calculus. And even those that are close to us, they only get exposed to so much. I'm married. My husband is a white male, older than me. And, he might reference something from, when I was in my 20s or something, or us dating. It's like, why would I have brought that up to you? You were just a guy I was dating. You think I just bring this up to everyone? It's not that my views on the subject change. Your level change, your importance changed, and now you get this level of information.
Wow, so that's powerful, man. That's
those conversations.
That's so powerful, right? Because I remember I had this guy that I was friends with when I was young, and we were very close. And I was, again, my experience is very much being the only black person. That defines you were saying, Gwynn, how your experiences define who you are. And that's absolutely right. That ends up being the bread and butter in some ways of who I am. So, I had this friend way back in the day, and we were walking down the street, and we smoked cigarettes back then, right? Right. We were young, and we drank and smoked pot, and we smoked cigarettes. That's what we did. We were 16, and
I relate to that.
I'll bet. I bet you we all do in some way, right? So we were walking down the street, and it was a Parliament. Remember how Parliaments have the recessed filter, and when it got wet, the filter would kind of And he said, oh, and he handed the cigarette to another friend, and he said, I N-word lipped it, but he didn't say N-word, right? And he said that in front of me at the time. And I didn't say anything at the time because I was a black kid trying desperately to stand out. Try not to stand out, right? Trying to not be black in some ways, right? And so I didn't say anything then. And but then not randomly, but one of my friends got married. One of our mutual friends got married, and he called me like the night before just to like talk or whatever. And at the end of that conversation, I said, "You know what?" And it just popped into my head. I was just like, "You said that to me, and I never forgot that, and that was really fucked up." And he was like, "Why are you bringing this up now? Why are you bringing this up now?" And to your point, Stephanie's like, "I don't know. This is just when it became important enough for me to talk about it, and I don't owe it to you." I don't owe you an explanation for that, right? I mean, like, this is just when it seemed relevant to me, and here we are, we're having this conversation, right? Anyway, I want to talk now about the article specifically, the one that you penned, Stephanie, which was published on pharmalive.com, and we'll put a link to the article in the show notes. Will you tell us a little bit about your article, and what would you like our audience to take away from it? I know what I took away from it, but I would like you to talk about what you... I got a lot from it. I thought it was a great... I mean, I read the article and like immediately texted you right after I was like, coming on the show. So I got something out of it.
It was just like a culmination of experiences and relationships, namely Gwen. In my work in advertising, we're often, the client knows the audience that they're trying to reach. Sometimes we do research to determine if that's truly their audience, but for the most part, it's how can we most effectively reach this audience, communicate this message. And I deal a lot with healthcare. And we were working on this account where the prevailing thought was that they needed to say her and she over and over and over to make it feel more personal, to help the physicians feel connected to the patients. And you can help her with this. And when she comes to you, just over the, and, just after enough like conversations and exposure, it hit me and I felt like a moron. But it's like, my friend is missing from this. It's like, so like, would they ever be talked to? Or no, they would just be missed completely. Like, well, that's sort of shitty. And so I, like volunteered and said, I think we're missing some of the audience, not everyone, who qualifies for this would identify as female, would identify as a woman. And they're just like, yeah, this is not really the place right now. Why don't you like write a POV? That's half a brush off and half a good suggestion to just say like, prove it, prove it's not just something you're saying, but there's some actual meat behind it. And so I just went about doing some of the research. I talked to Gwen some and he got involved and it just took off from there.
Yeah, I thought, like I said, I thought it was really good. First of all, I love the sort of action items that you suggested at the end, right? Because so often pieces like this, I think we can be on this show can be guilty of this as well, which is sort of just pointing out problems without pointing out solutions, right? I think that is something that is super annoying. It is not useful. I mean, it's just like, all right, great. So the world is shitty. And what can we, like, right now, what do I do? Do I just go home and feel shitty about this? Right? Like, so I really appreciated that. I thought that I thought it was very powerful how you brought in the Gillette ad, right? And how, right, having trans folks in the Gillette ad and how that's so powerful. Gwynn, I want to ask you too, and because before I comment on it, was there any element or idea in Stephanie's piece that you could identify with particularly? Was there a sentence that made you say, "Oof, I felt that one in my gut"?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much of it that it was almost educational to me, like as weird as that might sound. Just even going through this process, like I think I had mentioned to Stephanie a visit that I took to go to, see my primary care physician. And then it was just like kind of an awkward visit, talking about sort of like transitioning. And then, I think just like listening to Stephanie talk about how, the origin story of this work for her, that it was like she, her, she, her. And like that is as a trans person, like that is, sort of like death by a thousand cuts to be in a scenario where you're just like misgendered and pronouns are just like, the wrong pronouns are thrown out in reference to you. It just hurt. Like you feel it every time. And so, I really identify with that. I think from the article, there were a couple of things that I learned. Like, first of all, I didn't know that I had a 50% chance of developing cancer. So that was, I guess the more you know.
The more you know.
Like, okay, great. So that was cool.
That's cool.
Yep. But I mean, like in all seriousness, like that's, there are so many, I'm generalizing here, but I know anecdotally that there's so many trans folks who don't want to go to the doctor because of that situation that I just described, of just totally being misgendered or having to assume their old, the gender that they were assigned at birth, to just kind of like not have a hard time or make it, not feel like they're imposing on the staff or the doctors. And, that idea of the privilege of an irrefutable identity that Stephanie talks about in the piece is, that's the thing that I think I'm still processing. It coming out as trans, before I came out as trans, people would see me and they did they could gather things about my story or who I was based on looking at me, sort of. They could make stuff and maybe be right. And now it's like it's just so interesting because it's like I don't have an irrefutable identity for a lot of folks unless they know me very well and I've really like let them in and they've been a part of my journey. So it's just interesting. Like my doctor's not that person, nor should they be. So like they need to kind of adjust how they're approaching it. And I think as we'll get into, but I think the beautiful thing that Stephanie did was mentioned was like it's an action plan. It's a real action plan. There's a responsibility matrix. There are action steps. So like you can actually go and action from her piece the things that need to happen for there to be real change.
Yeah. And all of what you said is very powerful. What you said in the end there was really powerful. What jumped into my mind when you were talking about the pronouns, et cetera. And this is something that, frankly, that I think this is for those of us who think of ourselves as progressives and those of us who really want to understand the experience of those of us who are not, who have different experiences than us. It can be tough. We are like, and it's fitting that the name of the piece was Break the Binary because it's so easy let me use an analogy. like good old old school, progressives even would say, oh, who is the man in that lesbian relationship, right? As if somebody has to fit into these categories, right? So you might be trans, but you can't be non-binary because we can't even understand that. Like you can't be a they. You have to, right? Sure, you can transition from he to she, but you're still transitioning from one binary to another binary in some sense, right? And that I think is something that really is like hit on, I think, in the piece, and something that I think is that. I can only imagine being on the inside and hearing some being misgendered and being even as you are right now, right? Presenting as a he, right? But it's a little more complicated than that, right? That doesn't really fully tell the whole story. And this gets back to my theme, which is like this idea of being seen for who you are, right? And how that can be. And I think it's really fascinating, Gwynn, that it's actually in some senses gotten harder as you have presented differently. I think that's a really sort of interesting twist in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned something like the non-binary piece is that's a huge part of this, because there are many folks who may be perceived as presenting a particular way, who identify as non-binary and use they, them pronouns, or some, sometimes do or sometimes don't. And they're not, that aspect of them is not seen at all. It's not, because you have to really ask, and you have to really know how to kind of, I mean, I remember the first time anybody asked me what my pronouns were, that was, or I think they introduced themselves with their pronouns, and then they were like, what are your pronouns? And I was like, and that started me on like a huge journey, like I was at the time using she, her pronouns. And I was like, what are my pronouns? Nobody's ever asked me that before. And actually that was when I started working at Meetup. So, that kind of environment that opens up, that possibility where you don't have to be, we're not assuming that everybody is a he or everybody is a she. You could be anything. That's a beautiful space to live in, I think. And it offers that inclusion. And yeah, it's awesome.
I love that. I really do. I'm sorry, Stephanie, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about like your T-shirt, Defo, and the intersectionality, as Gwen was talking about, and sort of like mind being blown. I've just been so accustomed, looking at race, thinking of race. I will watch Scooby-Doo and be like, how are they in New Orleans and there are no black people? I don't know how that's a thing. And my kids
New Orleans
are like,
is all black people.
Yeah. My kids are like, let it go, Mom, let it go. But like, and then to like have eyes like further open and they're like, oh, and there's like so much more I'm not missing. I mean, to have conversations with my colleagues about, we just have to help the physicians know how to treat people, how these people want to be treated. And when you talk about the binary, like transition from one binary to another, it's because our thinking is it's so stuck in that. I'm like, so basically the question is, do you want to be treated like a guy or treated like a girl?
Oh
like,
my God, what a great point.
How do you want to be treated? What words can I use with you? Have touch, no touch? How about you don't touch anybody? How about that one? How about and so there's just all these things that go with it. And as people ask questions or they like reflect something back to me, I was like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. That's like taking it even deeper.
That's such a great point. And that's such an interesting thing, that what you said right now, we're intersectionality, right? Patriarchy, right? We're talking about this idea now that's like, all right, so if you're a woman, I will treat you this way. And if you're a man, I will treat you this way. And that might be a subtle difference, but it is a difference, right? And this non-binary thinking and thinking on perhaps a spectrum, thinking in non-binary terms is a challenge for all of us, I think, to look at how gendered our entire experiences. Like everything we do is so gendered. It's putting a big mirror up to us, I think. I wanted to go back to what you said too, Gwen. I can't imagine like the experience of being afraid to go to the doctor, right? Like, because I mean, and I'm just going to connect this to, because a lot of black folks have had really shitty experiences historically with doctors, right? I mean, the black community has been terrorized by doctors in the past. And so I imagine for trans folks and frankly the entire LGBTQ community plus community, there is I'm sure a like intergenerational pain and mistrust when it comes to the medical establishment, I would imagine. So I mean, I don't know, and I wonder if you can comment on that, and if you have any personal experience with that, or folks that perhaps that or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic. It's living so close to New York City. I've been privileged enough, lucky enough. I mean, it's a privilege, shouldn't be, to be able to go to centers like Callan Lord, where there are incredible. It's centered around healthcare for LGBTQIA communities, and so. Even when I started to transition, there's a great center here in New Jersey in Somerville called the Proud Center at Robert Wood Johnson Hospital. But that's not convenient for me to go there like every time I need to go to the doctor. So I have a primary care physician in Summit or in Livingston, and it's been going there to visit. I think that's like what I first mentioned to Stephanie about this was like sharing my experience. Like the doctor was just like, she's a fine doctor, like she's as fine a doctor as may exist, but she has no experience with trans folks. And so she's, her question to me when I was sharing, I'm transitioning, she was like, well, what's your end game? It's like, I don't like at that time. I mean, I and even now, like, I don't know what my end game. Like, there is no end game. Like I said, I joke like I'm gonna die one day.
Right. That's obviously gonna happen. I don't know.
The end game for all of us. But even that kind of question, which is like relatively innocuous, but it's just like what is the purpose of that? Like, what are you asking me? Like, I don't understand. I mean, I think what she was trying to get at was kind of what Stephanie was alluding to. Like, how should I treat you? Do you want to be treated like a guy? I'm not like, I right now don't have, like, I have health concerns that are related to being assigned female at birth. So I need to be able to go to a place where I can get gynecological treatment and, breast exams and whatever, and not like, I make it as kind of like, like as safe and not a hard, like a really hard experience or traumatic experience as possible. Usually when I have to do those things, I go to the Proud Center.
I see.
But for folks who are living in different states that don't have that kind of access, and even what we're seeing now with the trans youth and the legislation against, life-saving hormone blocking therapies, it's a real, I mean, this is a real time when people, there's a lot of exclusionary legislation out there that's really going to harm folks if action isn't taken swiftly. Kids, when I say kids, I mean like the youth, the trans youth, having access to be able to block to hormone blockers at a particular age can be the difference between life or death. And having doctors who can understand those issues, they're lifesavers. They are literally lifesavers. So the more we can start training our medical establishments to not think in terms of gender and to think in terms of the well-being of a patient, the better.
Yeah, that's so well said. So well said. Bravo, bravo, bravo. So well said. I couldn't possibly agree more. There was two things that jumped into my mind then. Jumping first of all to the astronomical suicide rate among trans folks and Black trans women. The deaths are just. I mean, it's like more dangerous than being a soldier in Iraq. Like it's bad. It's really, really bad. I don't have to tell you that. But that is perhaps a little more obvious than to the extent that that's obvious. It's obvious to us. It's not obvious to a lot of people. But the death by a million paper cuts that you mentioned before, that really was, I felt that one because it's about those microaggressions, right? That's really what day-to-day life is like. It's like, right, people ask me about racism as a Black person. I say, I don't walk around hearing the N-word all the time, right? Like, I don't even walk around seeing, like, straight-up racism all the time. I mean, I do. I mean, I see white supremacy all the time, but that's, like, kind of low-key in the background, right? It's not like, that's always there. It's always been there. It's one of those things, Stephanie, that most people I won't even talk to about it, right? But, like, sometimes if it comes up for whatever reason. But it's the little comments. It's the like for like I mean I'm just sort of identifying a little bit with your with the misgendering thing, right? With the mispronoun, the wrong pronouns, the misgendering, whether that be intentional or intentional, that sort of stuff. The one little cut doesn't hurt, but that builds the fuck up. It really, really does. And I've had those moments where I've just like lost it. Like somebody might say something. Yeah. And it's just like, you happen to be the wrong guy on the wrong day, like whatever. Mm-hmm. And like months of this is built up, right? And I'm just like, what the fuck? Where the fuck do you get off, right? And I think that's hard for a lot of folks to wrap their mind. I think a lot of folks can wrap their mind around straight up homophobia, straight up transphobia, straight up racism. But I think it's hard for some folks, to be honest, white folks, white men, really, cisgendered white men, to really wrap their mind around that. I don't have any other comment. I'm just saying.
No, I mean, yeah.
I'm just offering that up to the ether, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I recently had somebody, reach out to me because they were just feeling completely overwhelmed with just exactly what you just said. It had just built up, and everybody reacts differently when they hit that point.
Yes.
Some people are angry and will scream in somebody's face or whatever. Some people will just go inward, and it's so damaging any way you cut it. Yeah, so it's a real, it's really hard, and it really does add up, and can be anywhere from like, I'm afraid to come out to my family.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid, or I came out to my family, but they refused to use my pronouns. They always dead name me. Feeling, unseen at work, feeling unseen in society. Like, it's just, there's already like a general loneliness pandemic happening in the world across everybody, but this is even more lonely, I think.
Yeah.
You have to live through that.
I think what you mentioned, Defo, about, it just gets pent up. We have like our little bank, and it's being filled, and like it's max, but not everyone like has those things. So I give like props to like the white men who see that it has to be an active thing. Like,
yes.
In the same way, there's now this conversation about it's not enough to just not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. Like, the same is true with, gender and, the binary. And, I'm often bragging on my husband, but like he's been reading a lot of books lately. So, like race is one thing, we have like biracial children, and like he knows that he has to be up on his game with that. But one day we were at the dinner table, and we're like, we're something out of like a sitcom, because we usually do all eat, seated together. And we tease the kids about like their like future partners and spouses. And one day he just like made their spouse like same sex, and I could see like, I'll speak for myself. I was sort of like waiting for the reaction,
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, there was none. There was none. It was just like, and an answer came, it's just like our 8-year-old son, nothing. 13-year-old daughter, nothing. It's like, I don't know if maybe he wasn't speaking clearly, but like, and that's the thing, like, that's the generation coming up, where
that's amazing.
My daughter thinks that Lil Nas X came out late.
That's great.
It's like, okay. Like, it's okay. So like, it's a totally different game. So it's like, do you want your children to speak to you? Do you want to see your grandchildren?
Right.
Yeah. You got to watch yourself.
You got to watch yourself. And that's actually a great sort of a segue into the last sort of topic I want to talk about. And so I'm not a parent to any children, and I don't plan to be, but that doesn't stop me from harboring all kinds of very strong opinions about how people should parent their kids. Now, you two are both parents of children who could potentially face adversity due to their either their identity or the identity of their parents. How do you prepare your kids for that experience? And how do you instill anti-racist values in their kids? But it almost sounds like you don't have to. Anybody want to take that?
I mean, I definitely think I have to. I have a little white boy.
Fair enough.
So yeah. That's all I have to say about that right now. You got to work extra hard.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I don't, my kids are going to have a different experience than I had growing up. Our daughter is she's comfortable speaking up for herself, advocating for herself. She was in the locker room in middle school and someone used the N-word. And she was like, you can't say that. You're not a white girl used the N-word. She's like, you're not allowed to say that. Don't say that. And the girl's response was, you're like only half black. Are you?
Wow.
I was just like, oh. But you know,
but that, like, I don't understand how that's like a refutation of the fact that she couldn't say it. Like, what? I mean, of course she's a child, but still.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's with a lot of things. It's like me trying to role model and like provide a structure without controlling and specifically trying to maneuver them, because she's also she's not an extrovert by any means. You know, she really doesn't like controversy or conflict. So it means a lot that she even like spoke up, and that's probably more than I would have done. And
certainly
and
at that age, right?
Yeah,
like, that's like remarkable at that age. That's remarkable.
Yeah, and she's got like all kinds of friends, and like that's something that I like looked for. You know, was that she could see herself in her friends. And our son, you know, he's got like a totally different game where, like, you know, he's much closer with his father, and you know, he doesn't identify with like the little black boys in the story, little Jackie Robinson. He's not really seeing himself yet, you know. So I just have to like watch them over time. But I know one of the biggest things I wanted to do was just like not visit my baggage upon them, you know. Like until they experience it, even if I'm like convinced about what it's going to be, like let them see it play out, you know. And that's like very difficult to sort of exercise that restraint. But I also try to just get them to see like the privilege that they have regardless. Like, you know, she get two parents. Like most of her friends, their parents are divorced. Most of them, you're like, there's all these different things going on. Like she's got a lot going for herself, you know. And I don't want that to be the one thing to define her.
Sure. Gwynn, does your wife does she identify like does she identify as LGBT, or does she like I assume so, but I don't want to assume anything.
As queer. Yeah, we're a queer family, and she's like she identifies as bisexual. And you know, we're like in terms of like raising our son, like I'm called Baba, so my son calls me Baba. And when I say like I know parents, queer parents who are raising their kids as like non-binary, born, and they refer to their child as they, them, in pronouns. We did not opt to do that, but we are like very open. We'll sometimes say like, if you know, like we're not like if you wanted to change it, you know, but we're very open to whatever he wants. Like he sees me as a non-binary person. He refers to me as a person. He uses they pronouns. He often doesn't even use pronouns. He just calls me Baba, and doesn't say they at all. And you know, he's it's kind of interesting how much of the binary has come into like he's been has infiltrated him,
right?
Yeah, because we're not, you know, we don't like hide anything from him, and we kind of let him just like go where he wants to go in terms of like television and comic books and whatever. And he's super like sort of typical like masculine stuff, but every now and again he loves LOL dolls. Loves them. And he, you know, we're like totally, you know, he loves to have his nail painted and lipstick and whatever. And we're like, great. You know, we don't discourage that ever. And if anything, we encourage it. And I think at a certain point, like we are always down to have conversations around like, you know, we talk about bodies when we talk about our whole, like how he was conceived process. It was, you know, my egg, a donor sperm, and my wife carried him. And so it's a very, very collaborative.
Sure.
We talk about that. We talk about bodies. Some bodies have a uterus. Some bodies have eggs. Some bodies have and it's not about gender.
Right.
So, you know, that's kind of the language and the concepts that we're teaching him.
I love that. I really, really do. I mean, so my wife and I don't have any kids. One thing that we've thought about down the road, though, is adopting. So that's something that's if we do have kids, I think that's what we'll do. and you know, that will bring with it, I think, it's like a host of its own challenges, a lot on top of the challenges of having, the challenges that come with parenting and being a good parent and trying to prepare your children for the world. And, I was, both of what you said I thought was really, really interesting. Stephanie, I really loved how you talked about not transferring your baggage to the child, right? Because I mean, that is so what parents do, right? And to some extent that's going to happen inevitably because that's just how it works. But to be conscious of that though, right? To be conscious of that. And especially when it comes to race, right? Don't taint these kids, right? I am jaded when it comes to race because I lived through the 80s and the 90s, right? These kids didn't live through the 80s and the 90s. Things have gotten way better. They really, really have. It is really an easier time being a Black person today than it was 20 years ago. Definitely. And so why taint them? And I imagine that's even like a million times even more true in the LGBTQIA community because, just because of in some ways, there's a long way to go, but there's been some pretty large steps forward in the last 20 years, I think, on a host of issues. Even the fact that we're sitting here having a conversation about issues facing trans folks and non-binary folks is remarkable, right? I mean, this conversation would have been it would have been hard to find people to have this conversation 20, 30 years ago for sure. Well, thank you guys for being here. I wish we had more time to talk. It's just been an absolute pleasure. This is the first time we ever did this sort of little segment, and I couldn't have asked for two better guests to sort of help me carry me across the finish line here. So thank you so much for being here. And do you have any final thoughts?
No, thanks. Thank you for having me. It was really an honor to be here for your inaugural segment. And this is a really great conversation.
Yeah, same. Thanks so much, Defo. Just happy to have the conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that is the end of the show. Do either of you have any final thoughts? Joe, you want to go?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that clip you did. It was, just very informative. And I found it very human and very approachable. You guys talked about sort of each of our own perspective. Like, I'm a cisgender white man, right? Mm-hmm. And so what's my role here? How should I approach this? And basically, it's about humility, right?
Yes.
I just listen because I value a couple of things about knowledge and wisdom, right? I value science and I value life experience, and I don't have that life experience, right? And I am devoted to social justice and human flourishing. So in a humble way, I say, yes, I'm listening and I'm hearing you, and I want to know what your life experience is, what it's been like for somebody who's had those particular, challenges in life. Right, because of their gender, because of the color of their skin, because of their lifestyles or whatever it might be, their orientations, that's what we need to do. If we're not part of that group, then our goal and our sort of ethical stance should be to just humbly listen, be open and receptive to people's concerns. And then from there, act accordingly from that point. And so I'm glad you had, that conversation. It was wonderful to see. It was really cool. Also a lot funny as well. So
awesome. Thanks, Joe. And it really was great. And, everybody should, I hope everybody enjoyed it. And again, the goal, like you said, is to make things very, very personal and human and get really connected with people. And I think that a one-on-one style conversation is more conducive to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, as cliche and simple as it is, I think it comes down to just the golden rule, just treat people how you want to be treated. Certain people's identities or life choices or what have you might not make sense to me. but that's okay. Some of my choices and my personality quirks might not make sense to other people as well. I'm a guy who's got more toys than all of your kids put together, and I've got, venomous spiders for pets. So people might think that's very strange, but
Right.
I don't want to be judged for my quirks in the same way that I'm not going to judge anyone else for who they are or what they're about or anything. Just don't be an asshole, man.
Yeah. Don't be an asshole. And that is that is a great way to end the show. Perfect note, frankly. Don't be a fucking asshole. Drew Scott. So remember that if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles regularly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Christophe Defo. Thank you for being here. And remember that wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
The Radical Secular podcast is written and produced by Christophe Defo, Sean Prophet, Joe Okipinti, and Drew Scott. Artwork and design by Tim Stetner. Post-production and theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.